There is a quiet moment in every empath's life that no one talks about. It is not dramatic. There is no explosion. It is the moment they stop explaining how they feel. They still listen. They still understand. But something essential closes its door. The empath does not learn through logic first. They learn through sensation, through tone changes, pauses, emotional inconsistencies, and the subtle withdrawal of warmth. Their nervous system is highly attuned to relational cues, which means every emotional interaction leaves an imprint. At the beginning, this sensitivity feels like a gift. The empath can sense what others need before it is spoken. They can feel tension before conflict appears. They can anticipate emotional shifts long before words arrive. But the nervous system does not distinguish between love and danger when both arrive through closeness. When pain is repeated within intimate bonds, the nervous system begins to associate connection with threat. This is not a conscious decision. It is conditioning. Just as the body pulls away from fire after being burned, the empath system begins to flinch at emotional exposure. Each hurt becomes a lesson etched into muscle memory. Each betrayal sharpens the reflex to guard. At first, the empath tries to override this instinct. They tell themselves to be understanding, to be patient, to not overreact. They interpret pain as something to be worked through rather than listened to. But the body keeps its own record. While the mind rationalizes, the nervous system prepares for impact. Hypervigilance replaces ease. The empath starts scanning for changes in mood, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. Their breath shortens during conflict. Their chest tightens during silence. Their body enters a subtle state of readiness, as if emotional danger could arrive at any moment. This constant alertness is exhausting, but it feels necessary. Over time, the nervous system adapts again. If staying open leads to repeat dysregulation, the system looks for a way to reduce stimulation. Emotional withdrawal becomes the next protective response. The empath may not feel afraid in the traditional sense, but their body remembers what closeness costs. Distance lowers the nervous system's load. Less contact means fewer surprises. Fewer surprises mean fewer wounds. This is how avoidance is born, not from lack of feeling, but from too much of it. The empath system was designed to resonate deeply with others. When that resonance is met with inconsistency, manipulation, or emotional neglect, it creates internal chaos. The body seeks equilibrium. If harmony cannot be found through connection, it will be found through separation. This shift often comes with guilt. The empath feels they are becoming colder, harder, less loving. But what is actually happening is neurological self-regulation. The system is trying to stabilize itself after prolonged emotional strain. Avoidance reduces nervous system activation. Silence reduces overwhelm. Detachment becomes medicine. Yet there is a cost. When the empath suppresses their natural orientation toward connection, parts of the self go dormant. Joy becomes muted alongside pain. Curiosity fades with trust. The nervous system may feel calmer, but the soul feels constricted. This creates an inner conflict, safety versus aliveness. The empath often mistakes this numbness for healing. It feels like peace because the storms have stopped, but this peace is fragile. It depends on continued distance. Any attempt at closeness threatens to reactivate the old patterns stored in the body. This is why logic alone cannot undo avoidance. You cannot reason your nervous system into trust. Trust is rebuilt through repeated experiences of safety, consistency, and repair. The body must learn slowly that connection no longer equals harm. Pain taught the nervous system to close. Healing teaches it how to open without collapse. This requires awareness. The empath must recognize that their avoidance is not a personality flaw, but a learned response. A survival adaptation that once served a purpose. When this understanding arrives, self-judgment softens, compassion replaces shame. The nervous system does not need force. It needs proof. Proof that boundaries will be honored. Proof that emotions can be expressed without punishment. Proof that closeness does not require self-abandonment. As these experiences accumulate, the nervous system begins to unlearn what pain taught it, not all at once, not easily, but gradually, through repetition, patience, and presence. The empath does not return to who they were before the pain. That version was unprotected. Instead, they become someone new, someone whose sensitivity is grounded, whose openness is selective, whose nervous system no longer confuses love with danger, someone who can feel deeply without losing themselves in the process, and whose body finally learns that safety and connection can exist in the same space. Avoidance is often judged from the outside as emotional distance, indifference, or lack of care. But for the person who has been hurt repeatedly, avoidance is not a rejection of connection, it is a response to injury. It emerges when the psyche realizes that openness has become unsafe. What looks like coldness is actually a protective intelligence at work, shaped by experience rather than intention. When someone has given access to their inner world and that access was misused, the psyche remembers. It remembers not just the events, but the emotional aftermath, the confusion, the self-doubt, the feeling of being unseen or devalued. Over time, the mind may rationalize these experiences, but the deeper layers of the self retain their own conclusion. They learn that closeness carries risk. Avoidance becomes the strategy to reduce that risk. This response is rarely conscious. People do not decide one day to become distant. The shift happens gradually. They reply less quickly. They share less personally. They keep conversations safe and surface level. They pull back before becoming too invested. These behaviors are not acts of cruelty. They are attempts to maintain internal stability. The psyche is choosing regulation over exposure. Avoidance also serves as a boundary when boundaries were once ignored. For those who struggle to say no, distance becomes the only way to protect their limit. If asserting needs led to conflict or punishment in the past, the nervous system learns that disengagement is safer than expression. Silence becomes the substitute for boundaries that were never respected. There is often grief beneath avoidance, a grief for the version of the self that loved openly, trusted easily, and believed in mutual care. That version did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was wounded. Avoidance is the mourning phase the psyche enters when it can no longer afford the innocence it once had. What complicates this process is how avoidance is interpreted by others. Friends may feel shut out. Partners may feel rejected. The avoidant individual may be labeled detached or emotionally unavailable. These labels ignore the history that shaped the behavior. They overlook the fact that avoidance is not the absence of desire for connection, but the fear of repeating pain. Inside the avoidant psyche, there is often a paradox. They want closeness, but they fear it. They crave understanding, but they hesitate to be known. This inner conflict creates tension. Staying distant feels lonely, but getting close feels dangerous. Avoidance becomes the compromised connection at a controlled distance. This pattern is reinforced when avoidance brings relief. Emotional distance reduces anxiety. Fewer expectations mean fewer disappointments. The absence of deep attachment prevents old wounds from being reopened. The psyche learns that avoidance works, at least temporarily. It provides calm after chaos. But self-preservation has layers. In its early stages, avoidance is adaptive. It gives the individual space to recover, reflect, and rebuild a sense of self that was eroded by relational harm. It allows time for the nervous system to settle and for trust to be reevaluated. Without this phase, the person might continue to expose themselves to harm in the name of love or loyalty. The problem arises when avoidance becomes the only mode of relating, when protection turns into isolation, and distance becomes permanent rather than purposeful. At this stage, avoidance no longer serves healing, it prevents it. The psyche remains guarded even when safety is present, unable to distinguish between past threat and present reality. Understanding avoidance as self-preservation changes how it is addressed. It does not need to be broken or forced open. It needs to be understood. It needs curiosity instead of criticism. The question is not why someone is distant, but what they learned from being close. True healing does not demand immediate vulnerability. It begins with restoring a sense of choice. The avoidant individual must learn that closeness is optional, not obligatory. That they can move toward others without losing control over their boundaries. That connection does not require self-sacrifice. When avoidance is honored as a protective response, it can slowly soften. The individual can begin to experiment with safe connection, one step at a time. Small disclosures, reliable interactions, consistent respect. Each experience of safety challenges the old belief that distance is the only way to survive. Avoidance is not a failure of love. It is evidence that love once mattered deeply, and that its loss left an imprint. When seen through this lens, avoidance becomes not something to be ashamed of, but something to be listened to, because within it is the story of what the psyche endured, what it learned, and what it is still trying to protect. Attachment does not change because someone becomes careless or emotionally incapable. It changes because the psyche adapts to unresolved pain. When wounds are experienced but not integrated, they do not fade with time. They reorganize how a person relates, bonds, and protects themselves. What was once a natural flow toward closeness slowly reshapes into guarded patterns designed to prevent re-injury. An unintegrated wound is not simply a painful memory. It is an experience that never found meaning, expression, or repair. The emotions connected to it, grief, anger, shame, fear, remain suspended beneath awareness. The mind may move on, but the emotional body stays anchored in the moment of harm. Attachment styles shift because the psyche must find a way to live around what was never healed. In early stages, the individual often continues relating as they always have. They seek connection, reassurance, intimacy. But each new relationship unconsciously reactivates the unresolved wound. Familiar dynamics appear again: emotional inconsistency, abandonment, betrayal, or invalidation. The psyche recognizes the pattern, even if the conscious mind does not. With each repetition, tolerance for vulnerability decreases. Unintegrated pain creates expectations, not logical ones, but emotional forecasts. The individual begins to anticipate loss, rejection, or disappointment before it occurs. Attachment becomes less about desire and more about prediction. The nervous system stays alert, scanning for signs that the old wound will reopen. This hyper-awareness subtly alters behavior. The person may cling more tightly or pull away preemptively, depending on what once hurt the most. For some, unintegrated wounds produce anxious attachment. Closeness becomes urgent because distance threatens to repeat abandonment. For others, the same wounds lead to avoidance. Intimacy becomes overwhelming because it risks exposure to unresolved pain. In both cases, the attachment style is not the problem. It is the solution the psyche found when integration was missing. The danger of unintegrated wounds lies in their invisibility. People often believe they are reacting to the present, when in reality they are responding to the past. A delayed message feels catastrophic, not because of the message itself, but because it echoes earlier experiences of neglect. A disagreement feels unsafe, not because of conflict, but because it resembles moments when love was withdrawn. Attachment reactions intensify because the psyche is defending against old injuries, not current ones. When wounds remain unintegrated, boundaries become distorted. The individual may tolerate too much, hoping closeness will finally heal what was once broken. Or they may enforce rigid distance, believing safety can only exist in isolation. Both extremes reflect the same underlying issue. The psyche has not learned how to hold pain without letting it dictate behavior. Integration does not mean forgetting what happened. It means allowing the wound to be fully felt, understood, and placed in the past rather than the present. Without this process, attachment continues to be shaped by what was never resolved. Relationships become arenas where old pain seeks resolution, often unconsciously and repeatedly. Unintegrated wounds also affect self-perception. The individual may internalize the harm they experienced, believing they were too much, not enough, or fundamentally unlovable. These beliefs influence attachment choices. They may pursue emotionally unavailable partners because that dynamic feels familiar, or they may reject healthy intimacy because it conflicts with their internalized narrative of how connection works. The psyche prefers familiarity over health. Unintegrated wounds make familiar patterns feel safe, even when they are painful. Attachment reorganizes itself around what is known, not what is nourishing. This is why insight alone rarely changes attachment patterns. Understanding what happened does not equal integration. The emotional charge must be processed, not just analyzed. When integration begins, attachment shifts naturally. The individual no longer needs to guard against the past because it has been metabolized. Emotional triggers lose their intensity. Boundaries become clearer and more flexible. Closeness no longer feels like a threat or a remedy, but a choice. Integration restores agency. Instead of reacting from old pain, the person can respond from present awareness. Attachment becomes grounded rather than defensive. Intimacy is no longer used to fill a wound or avoided to protect it. It becomes an expression of mutual presence. Unintegrated wounds transform attachment because the psyche is always seeking safety. When pain remains unresolved, attachment reorganizes itself around defense rather than connection. When wounds are integrated, attachment reorganizes itself around authenticity, allowing closeness to exist without fear, distance to exist without guilt, and relationship to form without being haunted by what was never healed. Every empath carries a shadow. Not because they are flawed, but because no psyche is whole without its opposite. The empath is defined by openness, sensitivity, and emotional availability. They move toward others instinctively, often placing connection above self-protection. But whatever is consistently expressed creates an opposing force in the unconscious. For the empath, that force is detachment. Detachment does not begin as indifference. It begins as what was never allowed. The empath often suppresses anger, refusal, and emotional withdrawal in order to maintain harmony. They learn early that being understanding keeps relationships intact. Saying no feels dangerous. Expressing resentment feels selfish. So these impulses are pushed out of awareness, stored quietly in the shadow. The shadow is not the place of evil. It is a place of disowned necessity. What the empath disowns is distance. They learn to be present even when it hurts, available even when they are depleted. Over time, this imbalance builds pressure within the psyche. The suppressed need for protection does not disappear. It waits. When the empath is hurt repeatedly, the shadow begins to assert itself. Detachment emerges suddenly, sometimes shockingly. The person who once overextended themselves now withdraws completely. The one who stayed through everything now leaves without explanation. This is not cruelty. It is the return of what was denied for too long. Detachment feels foreign to the empath at first. It can bring guilt, confusion, and self-judgment. They may believe they are becoming cold or unrecognizable. In reality, they are encountering a part of themselves that was always there, but never given permission to exist. The psyche is attempting to restore balance. The shadow operates unconsciously. When detachment emerges without awareness, it can be extreme. The empath may shut down emotionally rather than set boundaries. They may disappear instead of expressing needs. This is what happens when the shadow takes control rather than being integrated. What was once excessive closeness becomes excessive distance. Detachment as a shadow response carries the energy of accumulated anger and disappointment. It is not neutral at first. It is charged. The empath withdraws not only to protect themselves, but to avoid feeling the depth of their own suppressed emotion. Distance becomes a way to stay intact when emotions feel overwhelming. This shadow detachment is often misunderstood by others. People who relied on the empath's availability feel abandoned. They may accuse the empath of changing or becoming selfish. These reactions reinforce the empath's belief that distance is necessary. If being present led to harm, and being distant leads to blame, the psyche chooses the lesser threat. But detachment is not meant to replace empathy. It is meant to complement it. The shadow is not the enemy of the self. It is the missing half. When the empath integrates detachment consciously, it transforms from withdrawal into discernment, from disappearance into boundary. Integration means allowing oneself to say no without disappearing. It means choosing distance when necessary without shutting down emotionally. The empath learns that they do not have to be endlessly accessible to be loving. They can remain compassionate without absorbing everything. When detachment is integrated, it loses its defensive edge. It becomes calm rather than reactive. The empath no longer withdraws out of resentment or fear, but out of clarity. They can step back without self-betrayal and step forward without overextension. The shadow teaches the empath something essential. Empathy without limits is self-erasure. Detachment brings the lesson of containment. It shows where energy ends and responsibility begins. It reveals that connection is only sustainable when there is space for individuality. Facing the shadow is uncomfortable. It requires the empath to release the identity of being endlessly giving. It requires grieving the belief that love must involve sacrifice. But on the other side of this confrontation is wholeness. The empath who integrates detachment becomes grounded. Their presence is no longer compulsive. Their care is no longer transactional. They give because they choose to, not because they fear withdrawal will cost them love. The shadow of the empath is detachment, because the psyche demands balance. When closeness has been overused as a survival strategy, distance emerges to restore equilibrium. When detachment is met with awareness rather than shame, it stops being a rupture, becomes a resource, allowing the empath to remain open without losing themselves and to stay connected without sacrificing their inner stability. Withdrawal is often mistaken for regression, as if pulling back from others means something has gone wrong. In reality, withdrawal becomes harmful only when it operates unconsciously, when it remains unseen. It controls behavior from beneath. Awareness, shaping relationships through silence, distance, and avoidance. Healing begins the moment withdrawal is recognized not as a failure, but as a message from the psyche asking to be understood. Unconscious withdrawal is reactive. It appears suddenly, often after emotional overwhelm or perceived threat. The individual may not fully understand why they shut down, stop responding, or emotionally disappear. They only know that closeness feels intolerable. In this state, withdrawal is driven by fear and memory rather than choice. The body retreats before the mind can intervene. Conscious withdrawal is different. It involves awareness of what is happening internally. The individual can feel the impulse to pull away and name it without acting automatically. This awareness creates space between sensation and behavior. Instead of disappearing, the person can ask what is being protected and why. The first step in making withdrawal conscious is recognizing its function. Withdrawal is not random. It emerges when the nervous system perceives overload, threat, or boundary violation. By observing when and where withdrawal appears, patterns become visible. Certain types of closeness, conflict, or expectation may consistently trigger it. These triggers point directly to unresolved experiences stored in the body. When withdrawal becomes conscious, shame begins to dissolve. Many people judge themselves harshly for needing distance. They label themselves avoidant, broken, or incapable of intimacy. Conscious awareness reframes withdrawal as a protective response that once served a purpose. This shift from self-judgment to self-curiosity is essential for healing. Awareness also interrupts repetition. Unconscious withdrawal tends to recreate the same relational outcomes. Others feel confused, rejected, or abandoned, which reinforces distance and misunderstanding. When withdrawal is conscious, it can be communicated. The individual can say they need space without severing connection. This transforms withdrawal from rupture into regulation. Conscious withdrawal allows boundaries to replace disappearance. Instead of vanishing, the person can define limits. Instead of shutting down, they can slow the pace of intimacy. This preserves relationship while honoring the nervous system's needs. The psyche learns that protection does not require isolation. Another critical aspect of conscious withdrawal is emotional literacy. Often, people withdraw because they cannot tolerate certain feelings such as anger, grief, or vulnerability. By identifying the emotions beneath the urge to retreat, those emotions can be processed rather than avoided. Withdrawal loses intensity when feelings are allowed to move through awareness instead of being suppressed. Healing also involves recognizing that withdrawal is not always a sign to leave. Sometimes it is a signal to pause, reflect, or renegotiate. Conscious withdrawal creates the ability to discern whether distance is needed temporarily or whether a relationship is misaligned. Without consciousness, withdrawal becomes a blanket response to all discomfort. As withdrawal becomes conscious, trust begins to rebuild, not necessarily with others at first, but with oneself. The individual learns that they can notice discomfort without being overtaken by it. They can remain present with internal states without fleeing. This self-trust is foundational for relational trust. Conscious withdrawal also restores agency. Instead of being controlled by reflex, the individual chooses how to respond. They may still take space, but it is intentional rather than compulsive. Choice replaces avoidance. Presence replaces disappearance. Over time, the nervous system learns new associations. Distance is no longer linked to fear alone, but to self-care. Closeness is no longer automatically threatening because the individual knows they can step back if needed. This flexibility reduces the intensity of both attachment and avoidance. Healing does not require eliminating withdrawal. It requires befriending it. When withdrawal is welcomed into awareness, it no longer needs to hijack behavior. It becomes one signal among many, informing rather than controlling. The transformation is subtle but profound. Relationships shift because communication replaces confusion. The individual feels less trapped by intimacy and less lonely in solitude. They can engage without losing themselves and retreat without guilt. Healing begins when withdrawal becomes conscious because awareness restores choice. What was once an unconscious escape becomes a deliberate act of self-regulation. In this space, the psyche can finally relax, knowing it does not have to disappear to stay safe, and that connection and autonomy no longer exist in opposition, but can coexist within the same inner landscape.